Hello and welcome to Art of Reading. Today I want to talk about The 1001 Nights, a literary work that is quite unique in the entire history of world literature. It's a book that is replete with magical and marvelous tales, but the tale of the book itself, the process of its composition, compilation and finalization, is no less extraordinary and marvelous. The original core of The 1001 Nights probably goes back to a collection of Middle Persian tales called Hezar Afsan, which literally means the 1,000 legends or the 1,000 tales. Unfortunately, this Middle Persian book is not extant anymore, but we do know of its existence because several writers who wrote in the 10th century refer to this book. Hezar Afsan was probably translated into Arabic sometime in the 9th century. Initially, apparently, the book was called Alf Layla, which literally means the 1,000 nights. It is speculated that because round numbers were believed to have evil omens in medieval Arabian culture, the title of the book was gradually changed to The 1001 Nights. When it was translated into Arabic, many tales were added to it. In fact, many of the most fabulous and famous tales of this collection depict this medieval Arabian society set in Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq, in which the principal characters are historical figures from the Abbasid period, for instance, the famous Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. But the process of the book's compilation did not stop at this point. The latest layer of The 1001 Nights depicts a society set in Cairo in Egypt, which is on the verge of modernization. In these stories, we read about guns, about colonization, so it's probably the very beginning of the modern world. So scholars estimate that this latest layer was probably written down sometime in the 15th or even the 16th centuries. Fascinatingly, when the book was translated into French in the beginning of the 18th century, the French translator also added a number of books to this collection. He claimed that he had heard these stories from a Syrian storyteller, but as far as I know, this claim has never been verified. And even if he did hear these stories from this Syrian storyteller, he still modified and adapted them to suit the purposes of his translation and his audience. So if you just sit back and look at the process of the composition and compilation of this collection, we observe a very extraordinary picture. People from 3 continents, Asia, Africa and Europe, through many centuries contributed to the production of this book. So we can see already that this is quite a unique book in the history of world literature. We can in fact liken the process of this book's composition to a small snowball that rolls from the top of a tall mountain. As it rolls down, absorbs different materials so that when it reaches the foot of the mountain, it becomes a huge snowball. However, the most famous layer of this collection is the frame story itself, and perhaps the most beloved character in the entire book is the protagonist of this frame story, who is called Shahrazad or Shahrazad in its anglicized form. Shahrazad has recently been hailed as a feminist icon who stands against patriarchal tyranny and manages to reform a deeply misogynist king with her intellectual abilities. In fact, Shahrazad lives in an extremely patriarchal and misogynistic society. I would like to give you a brief summary of this frame story to show you just how deeply patriarchal and misogynistic this society is. The frame story opens with a description of these 2 kings, Shahriyar and Shah Zaman, both of whom are kings from the Iranian Sassanid dynasty. Shahriyar rules in India, while Shah Zaman rules in the Persian city of Samarkand. One day Shah Zaman decides to go and visit his brother. When he departs from the palace, he suddenly remembers that he has forgotten something, so he goes back inside to fetch it. But he sees when he goes into the bedroom, that his wife is in bed with a slave. So he kills both of them and he sets off again. His brother Shahryar sees that Shah Zaman is not in his usual jovial mood and is depressed, but he simply attributes this depression to homesickness. A few days later, Shahryar decides to go out hunting, but Shah Zaman says that he's not in the mood and he prefers to stay indoors. So he sits beside the window when Shahryar goes out of the palace and looks out. Suddenly he sees that his wife's brother, together with a number of slaves and servants, come out of the palace, go beside the fountain, undress and make love. This somehow consoles him because he thinks to himself, I'm not the only one who is an unfortunate man. So when his brother returns, he sees that Shah Zaman eats and drinks merrily and is happy again. So he asks him the reason of this sudden change of mood. At first Shah Zaman refuses to explain, but then when Shahryar insists, he tells him first the story of his own wife and then that of his brothers. Shahryar says, I will not believe this until I see it with my own eyes. So they pretend to go out hunting, but as soon as they depart from the palace, they secretly sneak back inside. And Shahryar sees the same scene that Shah Zaman had previously described for him. So Shahryar is broken-hearted and he says to his brother, let's go on this journey. If we find anyone who is as unfortunate as we are, we will return. Otherwise, we will renounce our claim to kingship. So they go on this journey. They haven't traveled very far when they reach the shore. And they see this huge jinn. A jinn, by the way, is a mythological creature in Arabian culture. So they see this jinn who comes out of the sea with a huge chest on his head. They are understandably very frightened. They climb a nearby tree and hide in the upper branches of this tree. The jinn comes out of the water, places this chest beside the tree, opens the chest, and it turns out that he has imprisoned a young girl in this chest. He says to the girl, I want to sleep. So when he sleeps, as soon as he dozes off, the girl looks up and gestures to the two kings to climb down the tree. And he threatens that if they do not comply, he will wake the jinn. So the kings, who are frightened, climb down the tree. As soon as they climb down, the girl asks them to make love to her. And since they are frightened by the threats of the girl, they do so. After which, the girl asks them to give her the rings. When they do so, the girl adds these two rings to her huge collection of rings hidden in her purse. And she tells them that these rings belong to men who have made love to her under the nose of this jinn. So the kings come to the conclusion that the jinn is far more unfortunate than they are, so they return to their palaces, and Shahryar kills his wife and the servants, and he decides that all women are unfaithful. So each night he marries a virgin, he makes love to her, and in the morning he kills her so as to prevent her from cheating on him. 3 years pass until there is hardly any girl in the country left. So his vizier, who is somehow entrusted with the task of procuring brides for the king, comes home dejected one day because there is no girl left in the country for the king to marry. His daughter asks him what the problem is, and when the vizier explains, his daughter, who is Shahzad, proposes that she marry the king. The vizier, of course, refuses because he knows that this means the death sentence of his daughter, but Shahzad insists, and the vizier finally gives in. Now, at this point, the narrator tells us that Shahzad is in fact an intellectual woman. It is explicitly stated that she's an intellectual. Let me read you this part. The translation from which I'm reading is by Malcolm C. Lyons. Shahrazad had read books and histories, accounts of past kings and stories of earlier peoples, having collected, it was said, 1,000 volumes of these, covering peoples, kings and poets. So you see, already we can see that Shahrazad is an extraordinary woman, first and foremost because she is literate, she can read and write, and this in itself was a very extraordinary thing for a woman in the ancient world. In fact, women were deprived of the privilege of education in most of human history, in fact, in most societies. Not only is she an intellectual, she also appears as a Christ figure. She explicitly says to her father, "Father, marry me to this man. Either I shall live, or else I shall be a ransom for the children of the Muslims and save them from him." So she marries the king, and on the first night, she asks the king to send for her younger sister, Dunyazad. Dunyazad comes and sits beside the bed and asks Shahrazad to tell her a story. Shahrazad says, "I will gladly do so if the king permits." The king complies, and Shahrazad begins telling her stories, and that is how she tells stories for 1001 nights. Each night she terminates her story close to the climax, so that the king would be interested in hearing the rest of the story, and that's the ingenious device through which these tales are narrated. One of the extraordinary narrative techniques that is used in the 1001 Nights is nesting, which means a character inside a story tells another story, inside which another character tells yet another story, and so on. This, in fact, can become very multi-layered and complex in certain parts of the 1001 Nights. Another very interesting aspect of the 1001 Nights is the sheer variety of female characters that are portrayed in this collection. In this way, Shahrazad shows to the king that his misogynistic prejudices, which are founded upon an essentialistic view of women, is absolutely wrong. So she manages to cure the king of his misogyny, so that at the end of the book, the king repents of having murdered these girls, and he lives happily with Shahrazad ever after to the end of his days. Another feature that I find very intriguing in the 1001 Nights is this faith in the redeeming power of stories, which is at its heart a deeply humanistic vision. The stories that Shahrazad tells the king are very diverse. They range from serious and tragic to comic and satiric. In this lengthy period of time, 1001 Nights, Shahrazad manages to entertain and teach the king. And I think we can also be entertained by the stories of Shahrazad, and we can, at the same time, learn from her. Maybe not life lessons, but at least lessons in the art of fiction. In fact, since the 1001 Nights was translated into the European languages in the 18th century, its influence on Western literature has been and continues to be immense. Thanks for watching. And as usual, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.